Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Literacy View. We have a very special guest with us today, but before I introduce our guest, we just want to keep you up to date with what's going on with the Literacy View. So Judy and I did an episode of the top 5 episodes of 2024, and we did a little recap. And later this month, on January 30th, we're going to be playing a trivia game based on those 5 top episodes. So stay tuned, because this is going to be something very different, and it's going to help everyone, all our listeners, internalize the material. Instead of it just being a one and done and we forget about it, we want to make sure that people are getting something out of it. So we're going to make it a fun way to learn. So we'll be announcing what's coming up. And Judy,
tell them the name of what it is. It's
edutainment. So we're having a good time. In March, we're going to be going to Research Ed New York City, and we're going to be presenting there. And in April, we will be at the World Literacy Summit, and we are presenting there as well. So lots of fun things coming up. So let's introduce our guest, Dr. Claude Goldenberg. Woo! And he is, I have his bio here. He is professor of education in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. A native of Argentina, his areas of research and professional interest have centered on promoting academic achievement among language minority children and youth. He also, and I'm going to put the link to Claude's bio in the show notes, so I'm just giving an abridged version, but the full bio will be there. Goldenberg co-authored Promoting Academic Achievement Among English Learners, a guide to the research, and was co-editor of Language and Literacy Development in Bilingual Settings. He was on the National Research Council's Committee for the Prevention of Early Reading Difficulties in Young Children, and on the National Literacy Panel, which synthesized research on literacy development among language minority children and youth. So we welcome Dr. Claude Goldenberg.
Thank you, Faith.
You're very welcome. And Claude has a wonderful blog, and I hope all of you will follow it. We are going to put that in the show notes as well. And he recently wrote a 4-part blog that is a response to Tierney Pearson's work. And this is part 3 that we're focusing on 3 cueing. And he said, we'll have to agree to disagree, maybe. And this article caught our attention. And Claude, I want to start off with something that you wrote very simply. All cues are not created equal. All cues are not created equal. First, could you tell us a little bit about what got you to want to even respond to Tierney and Pearson, and then kind of clarify what you mean by that statement?
Okay, I'll try my best. And thank you again for honored to be invited to your show, and happy to be with you and Judy. Well, what happened was, as I assume some of your listeners know, Rob Tierney and David Pearson, who are 2 very big names in reading research and policy and practice, and they have been for a long time. I'm no spring chicken, but they've been at it even longer than me. That's how long they've been at it. So there's a wealth of knowledge, information, experience that I mean, all full disclosure, I deeply respect. But they wrote this book, this monograph that they published online, open access, which I think is a great thing. So let me give credit where it's due. And this monograph was entitled Fact-Checking the Science of Reading, Opening Up the Conversation. And the basic setup was they identified 10 claims, presumably made by science of reading advocates. And their MO for this book was to state a claim, analyze it, say whether it's research backed or not, and then sort of circle back and say how they would improve it. Now, that was what they said they were going to do. They didn't quite pull it off, and there were a number of problems that I thought, it could have been a project that could have helped the field, help clarify some misunderstandings and some misinformation and so forth. But instead, what happened was these set of claims it was unclear who made them. I mean, a lot of people speak in the name of the science of reading, as you well know. People have different definitions of the science of reading. People have different levels of understanding and expertise to support what they're saying about the science of reading. So there was this kind of, to use a technical term, hodgepodge of claims. You weren't quite sure where they were coming from. And then they actually never got to the point, as they analyzed each claim, of saying, well, here's a better way, here's a more research-informed way to address this issue. They just never got around to that. So I was really concerned because I thought it was a lot of disinformation being spread by two people who know the research. I mean, you cannot accuse them of being ignorant of the research. I mean, that is not even an issue. But I just didn't think they handled the project in the way that was really productive. So I actually contacted them shortly after I read it. And I said, listen, I'd like to talk with you about this because I think there's some issues here. And I'd like to make some recommendations. I mean, you can take them or not, but I'm hoping maybe we could kind of get somewhere with this. And to make a long story short, we had some emails and some Zooms and some discussions. And we were making limited progress. So I ended up deciding to just sort of write an analysis, a critique, which I sent them ahead of time. I'm not interested in sabotaging anyone or torpedoing them, but I sent it to them, and they weren't crazy about it. But again, to make a long story short, they ended up publishing it on their website, as I had requested they do, because they want to open up the conversation. And around the same time, I started this Substack that you mentioned, Bates, which is kind of like a glorified blog. I started this Substack, and so I posted it there too. We cross-posted. I mean, that's the kind of thing we had in mind. And then I posted there not only my critique, but then they responded to my critique. And I posted that on my Substack, and then I posted a response to their critique. So it was this kind of conversation. I mean, this sort of interactive, usually in the publishing game, these interactions are stretched out over months and years. It's got to go through a review process. I mean, all of which is okay. There's a certain reason we want to have peer review, and not everyone should be able to just slap something up on the internet. Well, now just anyone can slap something up on the internet. So David and Rob and I took advantage of that. And so we had this sort of interaction. And the net result was their monograph being posted, my critique and analysis of the monograph, their response to my critique, and then my response to their response. So taken together, that's a lot of interaction. Now, I don't know if anyone has actually slogged through all those things, but if anyone's interested, there it is. So that was the point. Now, your question about not all, did I answer your first question okay before I go on to the second question?
Yes, I think that we wanted to set the stage for why you're replying to Tierney and Pearson, what happened. So It is in response to the fact checking of the science of reading. That's
correct.
The point.
Correct. Exactly right. Exactly right. So to 3Qing, and not all Qs are created equal. Well, let me give you another sort of backstory to this. Some years ago, I've been on, as you mentioned, different committees, synthesizing the research and, so on and so forth. And I was on one committee about synthesizing the research on early reading. And this was back in the 90s when, California, which is where I am, and a lot of the rest of the country, but California on steroids. California does everything on steroids. Had really embraced. Well, it's called whole language, it's called balanced literacy, it's called 3Qing, it's called literature-based reading. It's got all these names. And it was really very much embraced in California. And like many people, I thought there were some really useful things about having kids read literature. And, there's more to reading than phonics. I don't need to tell you or anyone who's listening that that's just a truism. But I was trying to figure out how to, I've been on sort of this mission, I guess, for the past 30 years to kind of try to break down the walls and have productive conversations and not talk past each other. And in fact, I wrote something for the reading teacher, I think 35 years ago, that sounds an awful lot like what's going on now. What goes around comes around and all that sort of thing. It's kind of mind-boggling. And that's really one of the reasons I started this Substack. I don't know, I just beating my head against the wall. And while I'm doing that, I might as well write some stuff that maybe is at least informative and entertaining. Anyway, I'm getting off track here. So I was on one of these committees, and by then the word cues had become toxic, just like whole language was toxic, and even literature-based. All these things become toxic because they get misused, misappropriated, imbued with meanings, the mess. So on this committee, I tried to make the point that, look, there's nothing wrong with the word cues. It's just a source of information. It's something that prompts you to do something. It's a perfectly legitimate word. The problem is that when you say using sound symbol associations and using syntax and using pictures and using context are all equal in the service of recognizing words. That's the problem. So when you talk about 3Qing, you can do that, but you got to differentiate. There's a hierarchy. Not all cues are equal. Some are more better than others. Some are more important than others. I believe that's a research-based fact. Words are best recognized initially by looking at letters and corresponding sounds. That's got to be your first cue to what the word is. And then other things need to kick in, context, even pictures, and so on and so forth. So that's what I meant. They're not all. Now, I was in that committee, just to give you not really a punchline, but the ending. I was shot down in that committee. People got apoplectic when I suggested using the word cues anywhere near that report because it becomes so toxic. But the problem was, well, I don't need to repeat myself. So anyway, this has been sort of gestating in my mind for a long time. And I finally got to trot it out because I believe that's true. Now, there's nothing wrong, nothing toxic about the word cues. It's how you use it and the priority that you assign to different cues.
Right. And, Judy and I have been teaching for a long time. So I've been in education for 38 years. Judy's been in education for 28 years, I think, right, Judy? 28. And so we've been at this for a long time. And I was part of Reading First, Claude. So, and I know you are a big name and in that whole world of trying to bring the science of reading to the masses. And it has been very challenging because we swing from one end to the other. And if you try to talk about balance, it becomes a very contentious conversation. So I'm going to bring Judy into this. So Judy, I'm sure you were listening to Claude, and I saw you nodding away. That this all resonated with you. So Judy, as many of our listeners know, was a reading recovery teacher. And, people are very much now against reading recovery, but the two of you were talking, saying, yes, in fact, there were some good things about it. So Judy, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're talking about how all cues are not created equal. What are some of your thoughts about how Claude responded and, some of your own experiences with that?
I'm actually super excited that we're doing this topic today, because this is one that I think even you and I, Faith, haven't really fully hashed out. Like, we were having a secret conversation on the phone the other night, and I think we started to, and I don't think we really went as far as I wanted to. Claude, I'll fill you into the juicy scoop. So Faith and I started talking about oral reading fluency, now that teachers are doing screeners. And the unfortunate truth is, I don't think that anybody's really looking at what kids are doing when they're, reading that text and analyzing what's happening. And I think we did a lot more of that, to be honest, when I was in reading recovery. We really looked at every quote unquote miscue that kids made. So we started talking, but it almost got a little uncomfortable. And I knew we were going to delve into this tonight. So I thought that this would be a great time to really hash it all out live while we're recording. I think, what's more authentic than having a real deep dive into this. But I do have to say, I'm definitely Team Claude and Team Faith. I've been on this journey in structured literacy probably for 8 or 9 years now, post or after reading recovery. And I still will stand behind that. A lot of my training was rock solid. I mean, Claude, we spoke even before we started recording about phrasing and fluency and the things that I might say to kids. And I said some things to kids today, your voice sounds kind of robotic, and, you need to read with more prosody and so forth. That was great. But what I think was the biggest problem with my reading recovery training was we didn't go in saying, we didn't teach into all those things. But after a kid would make a miscue, which I just looked up in the dictionary, it says miscue means mistake. I think we talked about that briefly yesterday, Faith. So I want to go more into that, because it says Merriam dictionary says that means mistake. But anyway, but what we would do is, we focused a lot on meaning first. It was a very meaning first approach. We were scared that the kids couldn't tackle the words. We would start with these magical picture walks. I would make these crazy book introductions. I would do little cheat sheets that I would write a book intro at the beginning of each book to save time, to make sure it was as powerful as possible. And it was almost like we thought that we had to build so much meaning rather than teach kids how to actually look at the words and decode. And for many reasons, that was problematic. I mean, for the earliest readers, we were using books that didn't follow a scope and sequence. So we were asking kids to decode words which they weren't even ready to decode. Something you mentioned in your article really spoke about me. You mentioned English language learners, and that's a big trouble spot. So I'm licensed in ENL. In New York, they call it English as a New Language now. They change the names every couple of years. ESL, ENL, tomorrow it's going to be something else. But those were really the kids that had the hardest time when I was working in reading recovery, because I was prompting them to use meaning, but they didn't have that vocabulary. And it was like, okay, now even though I wasn't teaching that student to guess, they were in fact guessing, because I was only teaching them to, decode that first letter, cross-check, look at the picture, and so forth. So that wasn't really teaching kids how to read. And I think, for a while in my journey, I was like, okay, MSV was everything to me. I mean, I saw those 3 circles. Does it make sense? Does it sound right? Does it look right? I was saying that nonstop. Faith, I can't hear you.
I want to interrupt a second. So,
yeah.
So Claude, listening to Judy,
yeah,
and your article here, what Judy was saying about our conversation before, when we had a couple of days ago.
You mean that secret conversation about the ORF?
Right. So we were talking, Judy had asked me, Faith, would you use, like an inventory and use
like a miscue
a
analysis.
miscue analysis? And I said, no, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't have kids read to me and not want to listen to what they do in text. But when you use that, the text could be really taking you off in a different direction as far as what kids can really do as far as their decoding, because they are getting meaning, and they might be able to read words that they couldn't read in isolation. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that, as well as what this means for the English language learner and how this can be detrimental to them if we're not teaching both language and decoding?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is such a important point, and a big chunk of what I've been doing over the past few years. Starting with, I don't mean to plug my stuff, but it's been about 4 or 5 years ago, I published this article in Reading Research Quarterly. They had a special issue. RRQ had actually turned into 2 or 3 special issues, or a series on the science of reading. And the editor asked me if I'd write something on the science of reading in English language learners. And so I had recently retired and said I wasn't going to be doing that anymore. But I'm just a boy who can't say no. And I'm so glad I took the opportunity. While I was doing it, I was kicking myself. Let's see, what is it? I can't hear the noise. Is that a bullshit or a cheer? Oh, a cheer. Okay, thank you. Sorry, was I not supposed to reveal?
The boy, no, I liked it. The boy that can't say no. What woman doesn't like the boy that can't say no?
Well, it depends on the boy, right?
Here.
So in sort of writing that article, I learned stuff that I hadn't known before from neuroscience and from just different aspects of the reading research world. And one of the things that I'll go in more detail if you're interested, but one of the things that I realized, that I discovered in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated, was that if you're learning to read and write in a language, you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. What you have to learn is exactly the same thing as kids who are learning to read and write in a language they already know. You have to, whether you look at neuroscience, the reading circuit, connecting the sounds to the meaning, to the orthography, however you conceptualize that in your brain or, behaviorally, kids who are what we call English learners, now called multilingual learners, they have to learn exactly the same thing as kids who already know the language. The difference is they don't already know the language. If you know the language, all you have to do, and I say all in quotation marks, is learn the orthography, right? If you know the sounds of the language, if you know the semantic system, the meanings to the level of any 5, 6, 7-year-old, you know those already, absent developmental anomalies and so forth. But generally speaking, a 5, 6, 7-year-old can speak and understand, has the oral language of a normal 5, 6, 7-year-old. All they have to learn is the orthographic representations, the printed part, the written language. If you're learning the language simultaneously, you got 3 sets of things you got to learn. You got to learn the orthography like everybody else does, but you got to learn the sounds of the language. There's a whole phonological aspect, phonetic aspect of language that you're learning as part of learning language, and you learn the semantic system, right? The meaning of the words, how syntax works, how discourse, all that kind of stuff. I mean, in my naive, non-neuroscientific way, what they call a reading circuit, I call the 3-legged stool of reading, of learning to read. Sound, symbol, and meaning. You got to make those connections. So what happens is that there's been a lot of mythology about English learners, that because they don't know the language, because they know another language, some people say they have a bilingual brain, so they learn differently. A lot of, shall I say, fake news, can I use that term, which has also been sullied for, I'm not going to get political here, but I don't want to say fake news. It's just misinformation. So, but the fact is they need to learn exactly the same thing, but they need absolute instruction and support in the learning the sounds of the language, the phonology, and the semantics of the language. That's what you provided. So to get to your, more specifically your question, Faith, when you have kids who are learning to read and you're telling them there's a 3 cues and you got to use what looks right, well, they don't know what looks right. I mean, nobody knows what looks right before you learn to read. But then what would make sense there? It makes no sense to ask that question. I mean, it's just nonsense to make it even harder for English language learners, kids who are learning to read and write in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. That's the key thing there. And to ask them to draw on cues that are meaningless to them is just, I mean, utter nonsense. Now, there's actually one study that actually demonstrates this empirically with a classroom of 3rd and 4th graders in a balanced literacy classroom. Now, this is not an experiment, right? So if you want rock solid causal inference and so forth, I don't have that. But there's a really nice study done in San Diego where they had a classroom of, mixed ELs and non-ELs, and it was a classroom that was using a balanced literacy approach. Now, these are 3rd and 4th grade, so we're not talking about early begin literacy skills. But this balanced literacy approach was premised on the fact that trying to draw out language and literacy and meaning rich, and all that thing that we talk about, which, I like meaning. I mean, that it would draw that out, but instead the kids were unable to engage because they didn't have enough language with which to engage. And so it ended up actually being detrimental to them. They didn't make the kind of progress that other kids who could actually take advantage of that. Now, I'm not making a plug for or against balanced literacy. What I'm talking about now is you got to think about it logically. If kids are learning to read and write in a language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, and you're presuming they already know the meanings of the words and the semantics and the sounds, logically, it just doesn't make sense. And then empirically, there's just no support for balanced literacy being an effective way to help kids acquire literacy skills. I mean, some will anyway, because we know what's the estimate? 30%, a third of kids, they'll learn to read as long as, you don't put them in a shoebox or something. But most kids really need some amount, from a lot to a little, of systematic, explicit, whether you call it structured literacy, call it what you will, very structured and explicit and systematic approach to demystifying, that's what I think about, demystifying how written language works. There's some cues, there's some clues, there's some keys to that demystification. And when we withhold that under some very unfortunate theorizing that has been done over the years, then we disadvantage a lot of kids. Some kids they can maybe, I don't know, what do you all think? About a third, roughly, will learn to read no matter what you throw at them? I mean, what's your take on how many people are?
It's like what, 40%?
40, I heard 40% would read.
40%.
Pretty much, it doesn't matter about the instruction.
Yeah, you could be doing jumping jacks in the class.
And I think I think 60% need explicit instruction, and out of that 60%, 20% probably need highly structured approach with, and then out of that, probably 5% would need, a lot of extra help in that area.
Faith, so let me go back to that question. I still want more clarity. So what I think is happening now, based on being in the field, I think teachers are learning how to utilize universal screeners. Some have more experience than others. What I don't see a lot is looking at what children are doing with that text. Teachers are administering it. They're seeing, the green, kids are high, kids are low, kids are struggling, well below. So Claude, what is your recommendation? Are teachers looking at it purely from the visual, meaning the orthographic mapping errors that kids are making? Do you think that there's harm not teaching into, but looking at, okay, the kid said something and that impacted meaning? Oh, that's, something I need to think about in some way, shape, or form? Or do we just not look at it from that perspective at all? Not in terms of teaching, but just in the analysis perspective.
In sort of assessing what's going well and what's going wrong and what needs to be fixed, so to speak, or tuned up. Yeah, Judy, if I'm understanding your question right, I mean, first of all, this is, again, one of these troubling words that you have to really demystify or clarify what you're talking about. The notion of running records is very closely associated with whole language, balanced literacy, that whole thing. And there's nothing inherently wrong. In fact, it's a good thing to hear kids read and take notes on what they're getting wrong and getting right? I mean, we assume in running records that if no mark is made, it was read as printed, and you just mark, the errors, the miscues. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's a good thing. The issue is, what model do you have, the teacher? What model of literacy acquisition and development do you have in your head? And if you see using context clues as a good thing, kind of a workaround because you don't know the letters and sounds, from a miscue analysis, from a whole language balanced literacy, oh, this kid knows how to use context clues. Okay, that's good. Let's tune up some of the others. No, they use context clues. You don't want them to use those first. If they're stuck on a letter, you don't want them to resort. I mean,
that's what I thought, but it's still good information to have.
Yes, that's right. Because, kids are inherently, was that a cheer?
That's
okay, thank you. A big chair. Because, kids really are human beings. The rest, kids and normal people, are meaning makers, are meaning seekers. And if you put something in front of them to read, they want to get it right. They want to understand. I mean, they don't want to sit there, that's deflating. And so they're going to look around to whatever will help them. And the problem is 3Qing reinforces that. I'm sorry to use a behaviorist term in this constructivist space that we might be in. It reinforces what are actually maladaptive reading strategies. So if you're using miscue analysis, you want to have the right mental model of what kids should be doing, looking at the letters and sounds. And if they're stuck on that, you need to work on that rather than do a workaround. Look at the picture. What would make sense? That is completely dysfunctional.
You had in your article, I'm quoting this, you said, so if by 3Qing, Rob and David mean what David meant in his 1976 article, that mature reading involves using syntactic, semantic, and grapho-phonemic sources of information, I willingly agree. But if they mean that 3Qing tells teachers that when teaching beginning and novice readers, they should teach all 3Qs simultaneously and is equally important, we disagree. I think that is a takeaway from your article, because to me, that's the problem. We know kids are going to look around the page to get meaning, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like being demonized right now. The issue is that they're not looking at the words first. I just spoke to a parent recently, and she was asking me about vision therapy. And I'm only bringing this up now because this has happened to me over how many years I'm doing this. Everybody talks to me about vision therapy, and they said that their kids' eyes like bounce all over the page. Well, it's like, which came first, the chicken or the egg? The kids' eyes are bouncing all over the page because they're looking for meaning because they can't read the words. So before you run and give them vision therapy, teach them how to track left to right all through the word, and that they should know that. And then maybe magically they won't be, having a vision problem anymore. So any about that with vision therapy, Claude, because I get that all the time.
Yeah, no, that doesn't surprise me. In fact,
putting a lot on them when we were like saying, does it make sense? Does it sound right? Does it look right? That's a lot of information that you're throwing on a person that's just learning how to read. And now the brain is like mishmash. But I think, what's really frustrating is that people think that if you're invested in structured literacy means that you don't think meaning is as important. And the truth of the matter is, we know that meaning is at the core of why we do what we do, but it was the way to get there. And I think for some people, it's been a process in the read and recovery world. I mean, I haven't really been in that circle for a while, but I have to say a lot of the people that were in my circle, not the ones you see online, but the ones that are doing the heavy lifting and in those classrooms, it was a journey. And a lot of us were going on the journey. And for a while, we were all sleeping with our running records, and MSV was our whole life. And, the good thing about it was that we were really watching kids and seeing what they do when they read. The problem was we weren't going into it with a lens to teach them how to decode and decode well. We weren't following the scope and sequence. And then the journey started to look like this. This is bringing back flashbacks. People were like, okay, if it's not MSV, should it be VSM? And that didn't stay with me for a long time either. But, it was a journey for people. And I think the truth of the matter is that I think a lot of people are moving in the right direction. But I think it's unfortunate, and I have to give a personal experience that I had. Somebody recently said to me, all you care about is phonics. And, that's the funniest thing that a person could have ever said to me. Yes, I'm passionate about phonics, but that's because in my balanced literacy experience, we neglected it so heavily that I have made it my mission to understand what orthographic mapping is about, what it means to decode. And for the last 8 years, I've devoted a lot of time to that. But it's just so funny how people still perceive people that are passionate about teaching kids how to read and lift those words off the page. Oh, you just care about phonics. No, that's not true.
it really is just, it's frustrating, it's aggravating, but more than anything, Judy, it just, I don't want to get melodramatic, but it just kills me because, all of us, most of us got into education to give opportunities to kids, to particularly kids who don't have those opportunities, who particularly depend on the school to provide what, for whatever reason, outside of school doesn't provide or provides in a way that's different. And the thing that's just infuriating is that we don't know everything that needs to be done to teach reading. It's a body of knowledge. Call it a science, call it what you want. And it's evolving. I hope tomorrow we'll know more than we know today, and in 10 years, who knows? But right now, today, as we sit here, we know some things that if implemented at scale, as they like to say, would be very likely to improve literacy achievement for kids in general. Now, notice I say very likely, right? Because I try to be probabilistic about these things. There's no guarantees, right? If you want to guarantee, buy a toaster, for gosh sakes. But we know probabilistically that if you put these things into place with good implementation, with good support, with understanding, not just training teachers to do this, that, and the other, check off a list of phonemic awareness, check, phonics, check, word analysis, check, comprehension, check, vocab. No, but understand how these things fit together to fit into competent reading, a la Scarborough's rope, for example. We have a very good reason to believe, understand, that if we implemented this, we would see a significant improvement at scale. There'd still be kids with problems. There'd still be kids who would need tier 2 intervention. It's not the answer to all of our problems, but it just burns me up that there's so much that we know. And this is particularly true in the EL world, where there's been this sort of remarkable, just hard to understand rejection of, quote, the science of reading, because it's for monolingual English speaking kids, and that bilingual, emergent bilingual multilingual kids have different brains and they learn differently. I can't tell you what hogwash that is, and
So
how.
let's give it a BS button.
Okay. Oh, I
Okay.
thought you were giving me a BS.
You. No, what you're saying, I think we'll press it for you. You
Yeah.
can say it.
Wait, so Faith, just for the people that need to hear it again, what did we just call BS on?
Say that again, please.
We're calling BS on the whole idea that English language learners somehow don't have to abide by what we know science tells us. And that is hogwash, right?
Yeah. And that they have a bilingual brain that's structurally different, and therefore you got to teach them in a different way. I mean, there are more similarities than differences between how English learners learn and need to be taught literacy and how English speaking kids learn and have to be taught literacy. There are more similarities than differences. And I see very few people really talking about that. That's what I think the research shows. And this is one thing I came to understand in this RRQ article that I prepared a few years ago. Now, having said that, there are some important differences because, as I said a few minutes ago, they're learning the language, the sound system and the semantic system as they're learning the orthographic system. So you need to provide additional support, instruction in those areas. That's not a trivial difference. It's an important difference. But functionally, they need to do the same thing. Connect sound to symbol to meaning. That's the reading circuit. Everyone's got to create that, whether you're an English learner or an English speaker. And I see very little awareness of that in the field.
I think there's very little awareness. Bingo. And I know I have Faith. I'm going crazy, but I have to jump in. So I think that the ENL world needs you. I think that a lot of us are struggling with our English language learners. My question for little kids, what does their literacy block have to look like? Are they learning in their native language? Are they learning in both languages at one? How are we structuring their literacy block? Because I see so much going on, and there's so many people that will say they know the best way. And I don't really ask people to show me the data on the spot. Like, what are you supposed to do? Okay, pull out your research article. And they talk with such confidence that you're like, okay, they probably know best. And then you're seeing, so you're seeing maybe their foundations in English, their writing block in Spanish, their HMH or English language arts block or wit and wisdom in another language. Like, how do you figure out what's the best for our English language learners? Because I'm seeing a lot of different theories, and I know that it's very important to learn the native language. I'm bilingual, by the way. I speak Russian. But I don't know. And it scares me sometimes because people will say, oh, you got to wait. They'll learn English later. But who's to say that in middle school somebody's going to teach them English? There's no guarantee, right? So
right.
Claude, give me the scoop. I need the scoop. Faith, give me the scoop, right? We've been waiting for this moment.
Okay, let me try. I mean, do we have another week or so to discuss this? I mean, I'm happy to give it a go. Faith and Judy, you might have to invite me back, to kind of get into it, because this issue is the single most controversial, problematic, challenging, maddening, but filled with opportunity issue in the education of English learners. Bilingual education, I'm speaking about bilingual education, which for the past 75 years has been the most controversial aspect of the education of English learners. We used to call them
part two. That's all.
A part two? Okay.
Part two. We'll have you back.
Wow, that's sexy. I can't wait, Faith.
But so let me just say that the issue of bilingual education deserves its own conversation, its own podcast. And to try to shoehorn it in as we're talking about all these other things really is a disservice to something that I truly believe in. But I want to be very clear about what I'm talking about. Now, if we want to get into bilingual education now,
you know what? We could stall it as long as you promise me that you're going to come back, because I'm scared that I'm never going to see you again, Claude. But if you promise you're coming back, we can hold people on pins and needles.
Judy, what do you think? I'm a will-o'-the-wisp, I mean, I just kind of, now you see me, now you don't. I mean, there's a real reality to me. So I don't know
You
why
know
you.
what? I'm going to let you and Faith make the decision next on the literacy too.
Yeah. No, I'd be happy. We've been talking right now about literacy for English learners in English medium instruction. That's what we've been talking about. And that applies to the vast majority of English learners in this country. Most kids, most ELs are not in bilingual education. If it were up to me, they would be, but then so would all the English speaking kids be in bilingual education, because I think this is maybe scientific, but mostly ideological and value laden. I think being bilingual, and I think Judy, you'll attest to that. Faith, do you speak another language besides English?
No.
No. Okay. Okay. So you can share your experiences, and I think you'll agree with me that being bilingual is just an advantage. It's valuable for all sorts of reasons. Like you can tell bilingual jokes, and more people will get them. So they're very important reasons. But you got to talk about that in very precise terms and not get that confounded with what you need to do with kids who are learning to read and write in a language or simultaneously learning to speak and understand. And that mishmash, Judy, that you mentioned about they do foundations in English and they do a writing block in Spanish makes my toes curl. I mean, that's the kind of thing that really we just kind of need to get a handle on. I'm not saying that can't happen, but it can't be happenstance. It can't be, now you see it, now you don't, just sort of random thing. Yeah, I need some Spanish, so let's have a writing block in Spanish, and then tomorrow we'll do something else. That's part of the problem. Bilingual education, to pull it off, requires very serious infrastructure, competence, and experiences among the teaching staff. And if you don't have that and a commitment from administration, from the top down, if you don't have that, you're better off just doing English instruction. I know my bilingual education friends would probably hate me for saying that, but I'd rather have a really solid English-only program than a crappy fly-by-night bilingual program that doesn't really do any good for anyone. I mean, that's not a hard choice for me. My ultimate choice is a solid long-term bilingual education program, the goal of which is for English-speaking kids to learn another language and develop in two languages, and for English learners to learn English and develop in two languages. But it's got to be long-term. It can't just be for a couple of years, and it's got to be well-supported and sustained over a period of time. Now, what all is involved in some of the research, I'm happy to talk about, but it gets a little, shall we say, weedy. And I can send you a couple articles that describes it more, and maybe it would arm you with some questions that we can. I'm not trying to invite myself back, but I just think it requires its own topic.
You're right. I think that it would be overload to do it right now. So we will have a dedicated episode where we really focus on, ENL, ELL, whatever you want to call it. But bilingual education, I think, is definitely something that we need to talk about. But as I'm listening to you and Judy, this was a thought. Wouldn't you say that kids that have developmental language disabilities are also missing the language piece too? And therefore, they need special attention to that oral language piece as well. I mean, maybe they know like tier 1 words like table, chair, door, those types of things, but certainly lacking in the academic tier 2 type words. So I would imagine that, wouldn't there be some crossover? I don't know. Is that, am I off track, Claude?
No, but what do you mean, Faith, what do you mean by crossover?
So crossover between how you would teach a kid where English is not the first language and a kid who has severe language difficulties.
Right. Yeah, I understand what you mean. No, I actually, first of all, I'm not an LD specialist. I mean, you all are SLPs and got much more experience, so I would defer to you. But from my relatively naive perspective, one of the problems is within the EL world, which used to be called the ESL world, limited English proficient, and all. The terms change, but the underlying challenges and issues stay the same. One of the problems has been that EL education has either been equated with special education or seen as a sibling, a close cousin, the kind of thing that you're suggesting. And I think that's really a mistake, because kids who speak a language other than English, they might have a disability, but don't necessarily. They have a disability roughly in the same proportion as kids who speak English. I mean, we know
I don't mean it as a disability. I'm sorry. I just want to jump in. I didn't mean it as a disability. I meant that language component needs to be given a lot more attention than for the average, the typical student in a mainstream classroom. That's what I meant.
Yeah, no, at that level, when you frame it that way, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's part of the point that I was trying to get at a little while ago, which is that teaching literacy to these kids is the same, except you got to provide additional language support, because they're learning the orthography. I'm sorry, you can sing along with me. I feel like I'm humming a refrain. They got to learn the orthography at the same time, learn the phonology and learn the semantics. So obviously, yeah, that's right. I like your moves, Judy. That's the way to do it. So learning the phonology and the semantics is what you need to do to learn a second language. So that's exactly what they need. They learn that support. They need that support. Now, kids who have language disabilities or something, they would need that also. But my guess would be that you would have to, I'm guessing, possibly use different kind of strategies or augmented strategies. I don't know. I know in speaking with some of the folks I know who know special ed, they'll say, no, it's not qualitatively different. They need the same kind of support. So maybe I'm off base. I mean, I think there's probably a certain sensitivity I have because of the conflation of being non-English speaking and needing special education. In fact, let me tell you this. I did some work in a state which will be nameless, and a few months or weeks after being there and giving my usual stump speeches, I got an email saying, we're thinking of making ELD, English Language Development Instruction, a Tier 3 intervention. What do you think of that? And I said, I think that's probably one of the worst ideas I've ever heard. I mean, they just don't compute. It's like what do they call, the philosophers call a category error. You're thinking like about things that don't, it's not a Tier 3 intervention. So there's a certain sensitivity among us. I put myself in the category of EL advocate, even though many of my EL advocate friends would not accept me into the club. There's a certain sensitivity among EL advocates to conflating not knowing English and belonging in special ed or Tier 3 intervention. So I think, Faith, I was reacting to that. Sorry.
It's okay. Claude, in the article, you mentioned our friend Harriet. And Harriet, I don't know if you know, she was on the Literacy View.
I do know. Somehow I missed, I have to go back to my emails because she probably sent me a link, but I'm going to have to go back and listen to that. Yes, I absolutely know that. In fact, I have her to thank for our
lot of listening to do, because if you want to be part of our edutainment event that's coming up soon and you want to win a prize, you have 5 episodes plus Harriet.
Oh, wow.
I would agree with Judy. If you want to be our no BS bestie, then you have to go back and listen to some of those episodes.
Okay.
But what I wanted to mention to you is that Harriet came up with an infographic that I'm sure you saw. And Judy, it's a traffic light, green, yellow, red. And it goes along with what Claude is suggesting, that first we have to look at those letters. So she said, green is grapple with the graphemes. Yellow is flex the phonemes. So if something's not working, you try another sound, right? And then finally, the red is to confirm with context. So they're not all done simultaneously.
Right,
There is some type of order and giving priority to having the kids learn to read the words first.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I love that infographic. So
Yeah.
shout out to
Faith, if I could get back to like reading recovery, you reminded me of something, because when I was in graduate school or shortly thereafter, I was very influenced by Marie Clay. I told you that I that was before email. I wrote her a letter. I mean, this is how old I am. I wrote her a letter. Can you believe that, in New Zealand? And she wrote me back, and it was just, and it was wonderful. And
You were pen pals.
what's that?
You
Yeah,
were pen pals.
yeah. We were for a while. But I read a lot of her stuff, and I was very influenced by it. And that's why I wanted to see Reading Recovery in the land of Reading Recovery. And one of the things that really struck me, the title of one of her books was Reading I think the patterning of complex behavior. Do you know that one, Judy? I mean, the patterning of complex behavior, that phrase just really.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I've got it somewhere on my shelf. I'll send you a
It might
picture
be
of
in
it.
my garage, in my hidden treasure.
And so I was really quite captivated by that, and I didn't at the time think about what Faith, what you just said, and what Harriet's pictograph captures. That it's patterning of complex behavior. I mean, certainly that's what Scarborough's rope depicts, but you can't do it all at the same time. You know, there's got to be sort of like a protocol. There's got to be like a hierarchy. We got to reduce. Harriet and I talk about reducing the signal to noise ratio. That until you can do certain things with letters and sounds, that's a signal you got to work on. And if you try to do everything, it's just too confusing. I mean, working memory, all those things kind of kick in. Judy, you were alluding to that. So you got to pattern that complex behavior, but you got to scaffold it. You've got to demystify it in a systematic way, because otherwise it's just overload and kids get lost and they start looking around, their eyes twitch.
And I think that what people have to realize is that when a kid does become a successful reader, all those pieces do integrate, but we have to get them to that point of integration
Yes,
and
exactly.
successfully being integrated.
Exactly. That's right.
So I have one last point from the article. And Claude, you had said there's more to say that follows from the above, e.g., explicit phonics instruction increases the likelihood of reading success, but provides no guarantee. And while phonics instruction's effects on reading acquisition are real, technically significant, they are more modest than many science of reading advocates claim. Let's talk about those science of reading advocates, because I also have some issues with them too. Sometimes I want to press the BS button, even on people who I really respect, because they go overboard. So I'm sorry. Could you talk a little bit about that? Judy's
That's okay.
dark.
That's okay. I appreciate you being an equal opportunity.
Now, wait, this sounds like we're definitely in a teacher's lounge now, gossiping.
No names, please.
No names.
No names. Some unknown science of reading advocates, whoever they may be. And if you know who you are, you know who you are. That's all we'll say, right? So, okay, so those two things, the first one being that there is such a thing, was the first one out, there is such a thing as about over-teaching phonics? Was that the first one?
I didn't say that in here. You talked about the idea of, that there's a problem with spending too much time on phonics.
Yeah, and I refer to Harriet's, the California reading sage. I call her the California reading sage. Harriet, are you listening? And I cite her very nice piece on that. But the second thing you said that you referred to, Faith, was I say that the effects of phonics instruction are real, significant, but more modest than people realize or acknowledge. Is that the one you wanted me to comment on?
Yes, that I think there's a problem when people are these, they adhere to a certain way and only that way, and they block everything else out, and they kind of hide behind this SOR label, like, that's, and they're very strict about that. And just like you said, that phonics isn't the absolute end all. And, and you said that It's significant, but it's more modest than what the advocates claim.
Right. So let me give you a specific example quantitatively, because I don't know how into numbers you are, but we haven't done anything statistical on this podcast. And I'm not a statistician, but occasionally I like to kind of show off some of my statistical knowledge. So what happens is, there have been a lot of studies of phonics instruction, as you know, and there have been a lot of like meta-analyses, kind of syntheses where you say, what's the average effect? And by and large, and just crudely, broad brushstroke, the effects of phonics instruction or systematic phonics instruction compared to none, and that none could be a lot of things. It could be balanced literacy, it could be lots of things. The effect size is roughly on the order of about 0.5 or 0.6. Now, what that means is that on average, the median kid receiving phonics instruction is going to be several and meaningful and non-trivial national percentile points greater than the average kid that did not receive phonics. Let's say 15 percentile points, just to cite a number. So if you imagine two normal curves, one with the kids who received phonics instruction, another one with the kids who did not receive phonics instruction, the one with kids who receive phonics instruction would be higher than the normal curve for the kids who did not receive phonics instruction, but there would be a lot of overlap. There'll be a lot of overlap. What does that overlap mean? That overlap means that there are kids who did not receive phonics instruction doing better than some of the kids who did receive phonics instruction. Conversely, there were some kids who did receive phonics instruction that were doing worse than some kids who did not receive phonics instruction, right? That's what I mean by modest. If you had a resounding slam dunk in your face effect, then there'd be virtually no overlap between the two curves. But we don't know of any treatments, except maybe socioeconomic status, which is not a variable that you can manipulate very easily. But we don't know any instructional treatments that'll create non-overlapping curves. I mean, that just doesn't exist. Benjamin Bloom years ago talked about the 2 sigma effect. Maybe you all remember this, or maybe you, I'm the only nerd, who remembers things like that. But the 2 sigma effect means basically you have instructional interventions that are so powerful, there's basically no overlap between the curves of the kids who get that and kids who don't. We don't have instructional treatments in the real world that have that kind of effect. So we have to be realistic about what phonics can do and realistic about the limitations of what it can do. And that's what I meant by what I said.
Judy, do you have any last thoughts, comments?
I think everything Claude said was fascinating. I can't wait to have him back. And I think just to add one more factor is I think a key piece of making sure kids do well in general is that application piece. If we don't get kids reading actual text, you could be doing all the phonics up the kazoo, but if you don't actually show them connected text and decodable text and show them how to read, you're not getting very far. And you also have to have those rich read alouds and all those other good things. So I think application is a very big part of the whole.
Oh, 100%, 100%.
As well, but
you have to have a good thing that you're trying to apply. If you have excellent application of a faulty concept or set of concepts.
Correct.
So it's a long chain of event of factors that need to be in play to go from conception to what kids get from their teacher. There's a lot of links there, and if any one of them is weak, the chain breaks. And we don't have just one weak link. We got lots of weak links, beginning with some of the conceptions that we have. So we've got a lot of work to do if we want to really have the kind of positive effect in classrooms, what kids receive, and then the outputs, shall we say, what they learn, what they can do.
All right, Claude, I'm going to make a joke from my childhood. You're a fun guy. Ha, ha, ha. He's a fun guy. He's a fun guy, Faith. I am so delighted to meet you. Thank you so much. Faith, do you have any closing thoughts? If not, I'll wrap it up.
This was so much fun. You're a delight.
Why did you keep him from me? Why did you just introduce him to me tonight?
Claude, you and I didn't know each other before today, right?
That's correct. That's correct. That's true, Judy. Faith is speaking the truth. I can attest to that.
Never met him before. So I hope this will be, the first of many more times that we will chat. This was a lot of fun. Claude, is there anything that we forgot to mention or ask you? Any last thoughts that you want to leave people with?
Oh, don't open the door like that, Faith, because you'll never turn off the recording button. So, no, this
and that could be a problem, Claude, because I'm not great at editing. So don't cause trouble.
No, this is a real pleasure, and I hope we do connect again, either recording or not recording. I hope we can stay in touch. And this was a lot of fun.
Claude,
Very interesting.
we're waiting for you on the trivia night. We're counting on you to play. You got to be in it to win it. Anyway, follow us on theliteracyview.com. That's our website. You could sponsor us. You could do ads with us. And you know what? Stay tuned, because that edutainment is about to launch really soon. Faith will be promoting the hell out of it on social media. And you got to be in it to win it. There's going to be prizes. And one other announcement. Coming soon. Stay tuned. The Literacy View is going to have a store with merch. Woohoo! And it's not going to be the boring merch with the silly things. No idol worship here. It's not going to have a big, giant Literacy View. Maybe tiny. Stay tuned, folks. Anyway, till next time, everyone. Changing lives, one view at a time.
Thank you.